Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick.
That was very good, by the way. Halfway through you did that, I saw you reach for the glass of wine. You can tell it's a Friday night that we're recording this, and what the podcasters can't see, and unfortunately our guest can't see, I always think it's a surprise, but they've probably read the title. There's a bowl of Maltesers and jelly babies, both to celebrate that it's Friday and we're recording a podcast, and because my wife is not in the house.
And you don't know how to cook proper meals.
I don't know how to cook proper meals. What are we doing today?
We've got a guest.
We've got a guest. We're particularly pleased because not only we have a guest, but we're very pleased to welcome back our first proper returning guest. I think the cliche declares you to be a friend of the podcast, whether you like it or not now. I think at gunpoint or something. But our first returning guest, Dr. Waitman Wade Beorn, who the last time Waitman joined us, we benefited from his academic skills and expertise. And if you remember, and if you don't remember, please go back and listen. We talked about why people do bad things, exploring the systemic and institutional failures that led to the Holocaust, which for those of you who say, oh, I hadn't heard that one, is episode 43. And just Waitman, we haven't spoken a huge amount since we talked last. That actually happens to be one of our most popular, most downloaded and well-regarded episodes. And I'm not just saying that to get you on because you are here. So that's true. But this time, we've said this about a couple of our guests. We're so lucky because they have different angles on lots of these topics. And so this time is perhaps less leaning on academic knowledge and expertise, but more on practical knowledge around leadership and management. And the focus today, and I'm sure we'll wander around the topic a great deal, is around small teams. So in addition to being a professor, Waitman was a US cavalryman and attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, and subsequently commissioned into the 1st Squadron of the 10th United States Cavalry Regiment. And I think that's the correct, Waitman's nodding because it's important to say this in the correct order. And I think I said this just before we hit record. For those of you who do listen to the podcast, apologies, in the New Year podcast, I implied Waitman was a Marine, and that is not the case. And he's looking politely disappointed. And I saw your tweet this evening about our colleagues in the US Navy, and obviously my sister organization. So it is very important to get it right. Anyway, so whereas my expertise is in training stories, as Gareth keeps reminding me, Waitman deployed to Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom and commanded an Abrams main battle tank and then a Bradley fighting vehicle. So if ever there was a man who had an exciting company car, I think that was it. So Waitman, welcome back to the podcast. What have you been doing since we spoke to you last?
I've been working on this digital reconstruction project where we're creating this model of the Novska concentration camp that I've just finished a book on. We're starting to actually put it into Unreal Engine, which is a gaming engine that helps us to do the environment and stuff. So any day now, hopefully we'll have our first building put in there, which is exciting. And we mentioned before we started, I'm dipping my toes into the podcast world with a sort of forthcoming in the next month or so podcast on the Holocaust. So if my voice sounds just incredibly syrupy and fluid, it's because I have my new podcast microphone here.
That's we're actually both impressed and slightly jealous. It's this magnificent podcast on a boom. I always think you're only a podcaster when you've got a boom that you can move around.
Have we not made it yet?
Well, we've bought ourselves our first professional wireless microphones, which I'm very pleased to say the first time we tried to use them, it's an episode which has come out around am I allowed to tell the story? It was our
think so,
Sandhurst
yeah.
podcast, and we thought, what better than walk around the grounds of Sandhurst and say wise things, and as people run past, atmospheric. Yeah, we couldn't make our microphones work properly, so yeah, you won't ever hear that.
We lost a lot of content.
But by the way,
that's
it
fine.
was a lovely walk around Sandhurst, as it happened. So there you go. Anyway, that's not what we're here about. Waitman, we talked, obviously, the last time I was talking about the Holocaust, and you've talked just now about what you've been doing. But going back to your time in the army, before we get into small teams and we start getting nerdy about that, what drew you to the army and indeed the cavalry and life in main battle tanks?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to preface all of my comments with, I was in the army for 5 years, so there are many, many hundreds of thousands of people out there with a lot more experience than I have. So I can only sort of speak to my very, very small piece of the pie. I mean, the reason that I went into the army was because I went to West Point, and unlike Sandhurst, West Point is a sort of full 4-year university education, along with, on top of it, all of the military sort of training and academy life. And as it's a very, very good education, with lots of opportunities. And your requirement to pay that back is 5 years service in the military, which was fine. I mean, I was happy to do that. So I was obligated to serve for 5 years. I thought about applying to the Naval Academy, but ended up not, partially because of math. Also, this gets, I think, perhaps to your question. I think for me, the kind of leadership that I imagined took place in the Army as an 18-year-old kid appealed to me more than what one might do in the Navy. So to the extent that I chose to go in the Army, it really came down to which academy I chose to sort of attend or apply to. And so it ended up being West Point. And I think I might have mentioned this sometime earlier, but I chose, first of all, the armor branch, because cavalry in the United States Army is a sort of sub branch of the armor branch, which is essentially tanks. And a lot of my professors in the history department, for some reason at West Point, the history department is sort of has historically, I don't know if it is now, but when I was there, it was kind of run by the armor guys. There's like a mafia of armor officers at all different levels, and they were sort of our role models in a lot of ways. And before class or in social circles afterwards, they tell you about the Army, because part of the way you learn at West Point about the military, about the Army, is through interactions with people that are serving officers that have been there, done that. And so I was taken with the armor world, with being in tanks. And I'll talk a little about maybe why that was. And part of it is that if I was going to be in the military, I wanted to do something that you couldn't do in the civilian world, so I didn't want to be finance or personnel or, things like that, which are obviously super important. And I'm not downplaying that at all, but generally, if you're doing things in the military, they're under worse conditions. And I didn't want to do something that I could do in the civilian world, just under worse conditions. So I wanted to be in tanks. And the way that I got into the cavalry was I actually had my assignment changed when I was at the armor officer basic course. So once you graduate from West Point, you have, a month or so of leave, and then you report to your officer basic training course, which is basically all lieutenants, because all of us are equally second lieutenants, whether you graduate from West Point or not. No one's any better than anybody else. And so all the lieutenants from all the commissioning sources come together in various classes at the home of each branch to learn, what it means to be an infantry officer or an armor officer or artillery or whatever. I guess about halfway through, you sort of get your first assignment. You already know what post you're going to, because you choose that at the academy. So I knew I was going to Fort Hood, Texas, but I was originally assigned to a straight armor battalion. And I didn't want to be in an armor battalion. So I wrote to the squadron commander of the 1st Squadron, 10th United States Cavalry, and said, I'd really like to be in your unit. And here's why, et cetera, et cetera. And, as often happens, they pulled the strings and changed the assignments around. So ended up being in the cavalry rather than just in a regular armor battalion.
And Waitman, can you explain to our listeners the difference between?
Yeah, I mean, so and part of this is is me feeling very old because the unit that I was in, the kind of unit, doesn't really exist anymore. I don't think, because the Army has done all kinds of rearranging, with what it's doing and these kinds of things. But the unit that I was in was what's known as a division cavalry squadron. So every division, in this case, every heavy division, which means it's we're talking the infantry is mechanized infantry. They're in armored vehicles as well, and you have tanks, and the engineers are heavy engineers. This is not the 82nd Airborne. It's not a light infantry unit. They have a division cavalry squadron assigned, and the role of the division cavalry squadron is to provide reconnaissance and security operations for the division. So typically, it's out front. It's helping the division to understand the battle space, to find the enemy, as well as doing things like route reconnaissance, what bridges can hold tanks and which ones can't, which roads are the best roads, identifying obstacles like minefields and things like that, and finding ways around them. The heavy, a straight armor battalion, I'll come back to this because I know it's a little complicated, but I want everybody to understand, the differences. One of the main differences is in makeup. And again, I'm speaking of a division, a U.S. division cavalry squadron, which doesn't exactly exist as such anymore. But one of the things that's immediately different is that you have the makeup of each unit is mixed. So the squadron that I was in has 3 ground troops, which is not a troop in the British sense. A troop is a company-sized unit. And so 3 company-sized ground units, 2 company-sized air units of helicopters, of Kiowa Warriors, which are 2-man scout helicopters. And then it has an aviation maintenance unit and a headquarters unit with all of the logistics stuff as well. Within each cavalry troop, you have 2 maneuver platoons. So you have 2 tank platoons and 2 scout platoons. The tank platoons are M1 Abrams tanks, main battle tanks, and the scout platoons are Bradley, in this case, cavalry fighting vehicles, which are analogous to the British listeners to sort of the Warrior, a sort of light armored vehicle thing. And you're paired up so that first platoon is a scout platoon, second platoon is a tank platoon, and you always work together. And then third platoon and fourth platoon always work together, because there's kind of a push and pull, even at the lower levels, where the scout platoon goes out and has a tank platoon in support, because the tank platoon is the fist, the one that provides a lot of the combat power. Compare that to a straight armor battalion, which is just tanks. So you have a company-sized unit made up of platoons of just tanks, and that's it. And it has, obviously there are benefits and drawbacks to each. But the way that this works at the division level is that the cavalry squadron goes out, we identify where the enemy is, and those big armor battalions come in behind us and smash them, because we are more flexible, we're more adaptable. We are one of the largest battalion-sized units or so in the U.S. Army, or were 800 plus people, which is pretty big.
Presumably, as a result of that, the fact that you've got multiple troops that have different vehicles and different roles operating in one battalion, as well as the fact that your role is to go forward and find out what's going on, to scout and do reconnaissance, means that the command right down to individual vehicle level is going to be far more complicated, probably more complex, and you're going to need more autonomy because you're finding stuff out, and therefore knowing what's happening is, there's going to be a lot more uncertainty. Is that a fair comment?
Absolutely, and that's one of the things I was actually going to mention. One of the reasons that I wanted to be in that unit is because you're doing essentially what we call combined arms operations at the platoon level almost immediately, in a way that in a regular armor battalion you're not necessarily doing that, right? So, as a scout platoon leader, I'm out in front, but I'm also potentially talking to two helicopters, who are out in front of me and are overwatching me, which is something that you don't get to do as a lieutenant in most examples, in most units. And the division cavalry squadron works for the commanding general of the division. We were located for administrative purposes in the 4th Aviation Brigade, which has the attack helicopters and the lift helicopters, but that was administrative. When it comes to actual fighting, combat, we are the ones that go out and tell the division commander. We take his guidance and answer his questions. So we work directly for the division commander, which is an exciting thing as well, I think. But you're right. There's always a lot going on, and even as a tank platoon leader, which is sort of the entry level position for an officer, like you come in, and you are essentially always assigned as a tank platoon leader because that's the basic position, right? It's the first lieutenants and the senior lieutenants are those scout platoon leaders because that's more difficult. And so, and as a tank platoon leader, you get to sit back and learn what your job is going to be next by working with that scout platoon, watching what that scout platoon is doing, so that when you get promoted to that job, what's going on. But this is something that we can come back to, and it's true of all mounted operations, armored mechanized infantry as well, and straight armor battalions. There's just so much more going on at such a high rate of speed when you are in an armored or mounted unit or vehicle compared to a light infantry sort of situation. And again, my light infantry experience is very, very basic. It's West Point summer training, these kinds of things. But I've led a quote infantry platoon of cadets, again, and not soldiers, but with a map and a compass, and like we've done that kind of thing. And it's a slower paced form of maneuver, right? It's more difficult in lots of other ways. But you can live for a week on a 2 foot by 2 foot map sheet.
Yeah.
Whereas, in Iraq, we were going through, like 8 foot by 8 foot map sheets in, 12 hours, and because everything's happening faster at a higher rate of speed. And I think it's more, for me, that was one of the challenges that I was interested in was how to, be able to do all of that stuff on the move and keep all those balls in the air.
It's interesting, as you were sort of talking about the difference between the recce, the div recce versus the main armored battalions. I was sort of thinking about my time in the Royal Marines and thinking how similar things were in terms of the complexity of working in a commando brigade where you are working very, very closely with very different capabilities. You're working closely with the Navy. You're working closely with elements of the Army that are supporting you with your artillery support, your aviation, and all of the other bits and pieces. And it was until you started to talk about speed across the ground, because my experience is almost entirely that light infantry commando operations. And I remember having a very similar conversation again when I was talking with an expert in jungle warfare, and it's a whole scale again slower. Because in jungle warfare you're moving sort of hundreds of meters a day. In light infantry you're moving kilometers a day, maybe tens of kilometers if you're pushing it. In the armored world you're moving hundreds of kilometers, and so it's just a whole different scale of problem set, and some of that is easier, some of that is harder, but it's very, very different. We need to take a short break now. We'll be right back.
So training dip
Always.
was learning, always learning to fly an aircraft or navigate an aircraft. That's what I was training to do. The complexity and the ball juggling was something that was staggering in terms of fly your aircraft safely, fly another aircraft safely and prosecute a ground target. And actually, to be perfectly honest, that's where I failed, and that's why I'm no longer, I didn't pursue a career in the Royal Navy. But that is a whole different skill set and natural ability. How did people say to you, Waitman, this is what you've got to do, go do it? Or did they think about that in training? In other words, were you trained to manage this complexity, or were you trained as if you were a light infantryman? Because it seems like, as you say, you've got to fight 2 aircraft as well, while you're, hiding from another aircraft and while checking something out. How did you train for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it gets back to exactly the point that I think Gareth made earlier as well, which is to give you a sense of how complex things can be, right? Let's say that we're on a movement to contact, right, as a scout platoon. And so I'm, at this point, a scout platoon
it's probably worth explaining to the listeners what an advance to contact is. So contact means to engage with the enemy.
Right.
So an advance to contact is to move forward to find the enemy by maneuvering into their
exactly right. So
for a fight.
Or we can call it, a zone reconnaissance. It's basically for the civilian listeners, it's what you would expect. You're moving forward and you're trying to identify where the enemy is, or just identify terrain features, river cross, whatever, right? In a scout platoon, again in the Div Cav, it was 6 vehicles, so 6 Bradley fighting vehicles, and I think we'll talk more about sort of each vehicle's sort of makeup. But I was a scout platoon leader of 6 vehicles, which are broken down into sort of 3 sets of 2 wingmen teams, right? Me, the senior scout, and the scout platoon sergeant each have a wingman who is a less experienced guy. But anyway, so we're moving at 10, 15, 25 kilometers an hour, maybe more. I'm first and foremost, I have to navigate. So I have to know where I am on the map and where I'm going on the map. I have to make sure that my platoon is arrayed in the proper formation, depending on what we're doing, right? Whether it's all the vehicles in a row on a line, or sometimes in a V formation or whatever. I've got to sort of keep an eye out for them and where they are. So I'm talking to them on the platoon radio net. I'm talking to my vehicle sometimes on my platoon internal intercom to make sure that my driver is going the right direction, or that my gunner is scanning in the right direction, moving his turret around. So I'm talking on those 2 sort of communications. I'm also reporting up what we call in the military graphic control measures. So on a map, we'll draw a line that'll say, this is phase line blue. When you reach this, I call up to my commander and say, I'm now at phase line blue. And he has that on his map too. So it's a quick sort of shortcut of reporting where you are without having to put in a 10-digit grid coordinate every single time. Right. And they help to control our maneuver and make things quicker, because then the commander can say, great, go to phase line red, or go to checkpoint 2, and doesn't have to do anything except say those, and I know where they are. So anyway, I could be telling him those things, and also responding to his questions or directives. Depending on what we're doing, I could also have a set of helicopters that are also talking to me and saying, here, we see this, or I could say, hey, can you go look at this thing? And all of that is taking place without any enemy contact, right? Without fighting anybody. And so it very quickly can be very, very, very complex. And it's all happening at a high tempo because you're moving, right? It's not in some ways, and this is not to in any way purloin or to denigrate my comrades in the light infantry, but it's much more difficult to take a minute and take a knee and look at the map when you're moving along with a squadron that's moving at 25, 30 kilometers an hour.
Yeah.
Right. And if you make a mistake, it's compounded because now you've gone in the wrong direction or whatever. But they don't just throw you into that. The military, the US Army has some really, really great simulations where, you go into a giant building, the size of a warehouse, and they have these little boxes that you get inside, and inside it's like a tank. It's exactly like a tank turret. And you have screens instead of vision blocks and sights, but within those, you can look around and see notionally other vehicles in the simulation. And so and the simulation of confusion and talking on the radio and maneuvering, all of that is I think fairly well replicated within that. And then you have training exercises where you go out in the field and you do these things at the platoon level, at the troop level, and at the squadron level. And let me be very upfront. You have great NCOs, non-commissioned officers, sergeants, people who have done this for as long as you've been alive, in my case, who, if they're good, will train you because they know they have a good idea of what you should be doing as well. And, they will help you to learn what you need to do. And, one of the greatest moments, I think, as a young lieutenant is when you realize that your platoon sergeant sort of is ready to take the training wheels off of you and trust you to do stuff.
You're
that's
not going to get him killed.
It's great. It's great when you sort of feel like, okay, I've made it, he knows what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So I think it's like anything else. I mean, and I'm sure it's similar in the light world, with fieldcraft and all kinds of things. You learn how to do these things, but you only learn them really by doing it.
Well, it's the drill. We talked way back when you talked about counter piracy, that you drill and you drill and you drill and you drill. It's like, my son's going to be starting to driving later this year. And I remember the first time I tried to drive a car and your brain was entirely focused on the act of changing gear and then looking at a ring and, remembering your drills to the point where you were quite dangerous because you were so busy trying to remember how to do those things. You weren't actually paying attention to anything else. And over time, you drill and you drill and you drill and you drill. And all of a sudden, these things become easier. You're mentally, with cocktail party hearing, listening on the radio for your call sign and ignoring anything that isn't your call sign. And you don't have to worry about navigating because I know where I'm going. But
I think except that in this case, you can't do that because you're always monitoring that troop net so that you know what else is going on. So along with everything else I just mentioned, I need to know what first platoon is doing. If I'm the third platoon scout leader, I need to know what the first scout platoon is doing. Where are they? Are they in contact with the enemy? What are they up to? Is an artillery mission coming? So you have to sort of be able to encompass all of these things. And we haven't even started talking about gunnery yet, which is a whole another set of skills training. Like, how do you take that? How do you turn that vehicle into a weapon system?
Yeah, I think
which is a whole other area.
Two quite important points, though. One is, Chris's analogy of driving is quite a good one, which is, and it comes back to this idea of the things that aren't going to change. You drill, you practice, you do repeatedly until they become muscle memory, which allows you then to concentrate on the things that will change.
Right.
And that's to your point of understanding where all the other vehicles are, how that relates to the terrain, what the enemy are doing, what they're likely to do next, and then starting to think about tactics and gunnery, and because that's engaging with a changing environment. But the stuff that, in the driving analogy, the stuff that won't change is how you change gear, the pressure you put on the accelerator, and the effect that has on the vehicle. That's really important. I think going back to what you said about NCOs training you as a young officer, and it's exactly the same in the light infantry commando world that I come from, where as a young troop commander, you are put in charge notionally, but you have a very strong troop sergeant. You have very, very capable corporals and lance corporals who will help you because they have a huge amount of experience. And part of that is learning where you're ready to take those training wheels off. And that in itself is a sort of a lesson that it's a baptism of fire that all young officers have to go through. And some get it get the balance right better than others. But I think importantly, this idea of training people to get to the point where they're ready is what in the commercial world we talk about when we talk about safe to fail. Being in a position where you're allowed to make mistakes without it being career ending, without it causing significant harm, getting you ready to actually be able to do this for real. And I think in the commercial world, when we talk about psychological safety, safe to fail, one of the things that's often missed is assigning capacity to give people chance to practice, so they're not doing it for real.
But I think there's one extra thing which perhaps arguably by accident or necessity of the role that's different in that, and the fact that you have NCOs who you will be working with and who have done it, I think that's unusual. So the safe to fail says, you can do your job, get it wrong, and nothing terrible will happen, but you don't, by definition, have that person standing next to you having the short leash of what's right and what's wrong. You might do,
Yeah.
but it feels like that's more.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because there's no reason in the commercial world that couldn't be the case.
Well, I'll tell you what the reason is. There aren't spare people to do that.
Yes.
And the way that an armored vehicle is that there will likely be NCOs in your vehicle or next to your vehicle. But the point, I mean, I don't disagree with your point. It's just, I think it's too easy to say, commercial organizations can do this. At the end of the day, the commercial organization has the smallest number of people typically to do the job. And the natural makeup of that group doesn't cater for that. I'm cheating and I'm going to change gear. Did you see what I did there when I said change gear?
I do.
So the premise of today was about small teams. And what's interesting is we've started at the top. And Waitman, you've done a brilliant job of sort of describing the role of the broader unit, the part it plays in the broader fighting world, and the challenges of you, as it were, connecting upwards and being a part of that world. Now let's sort of turn it around and talk about the fact it's a big squeaky metal box that I suspect is quite warm and noisy. I've never really spoken to armored vehicle personnel before. What's it like fighting, living, eating, living in a tank? I mean, is this a 9 to 5 activity and you pop out the door, you turn the engine off and pop into the hotel? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's, first and foremost, where I think what makes the armored world a little bit different from sort of all of these other branches, or branches of the Army, is that at the end of the day, you are still a member of that crew. An infantry platoon leader is the platoon leader of the infantry platoon. That's his job. That's what he does. It's his only job, right? In a tank platoon, you are the tank platoon leader, but you're also a tank commander of your individual vehicle, because there are only 4 people on that vehicle, and you're one of them. And everything on a tank is very, very heavy, and everything, there are certain things that, both from a leadership perspective, to show that you are a sort of selfless leader, but also from a practical perspective, you have to be proficient, have the same level of proficiency as each one of your NCO tank commanders, in addition to your other jobs as the tank platoon, because you have to fight that tank as well. So you have to be able to perform the gunnery stuff, to fight your to fire your gunnery engagements successfully. You have to know how to do things like change track if you throw track. Depending on the combat situation, yes, you may jump tanks, meaning if your tank breaks, because you have to fight that platoon, you may switch tank with somebody else and keep going, and they have to fix your tank, which nobody likes to do. But you have to know how that vehicle works. You have to know how to, you should, because part of this is knowing what your subordinates' jobs are as well. Know how to put fuel in the tank, know how to change the oil, know how to change the oil, how to change the air filters, right? All these kind of things that you need to know as well, because you're in this constrained box of metal with 3 other people, or in the case of a Bradley, potentially 4 other people, but in a way that's kind of like a naval vessel, like it, without the tank working, you're just kind of 4 guys. It's the tank working and you being able to fight that tank that makes that tank a weapon system. If the tank breaks because you're not doing proper maintenance on it, you've just lost the ability to have a tank in combat, and now you're just 4 guys on a broken piece of equipment.
Gareth talked, and I could see him drifting when he told the story of the sort of the first time, all of a sudden, congratulations, this is your platoon, now go. And you talked about getting lost and panicking and going, I can't. What was the first day you stepped up to the tank and said, good morning, gentlemen, I'm your new lieutenant. I'm pleased to meet you. What did you do? What was your inspiring leadership talk to the team?
Well, no. So when I showed up at my unit, my platoon sergeant, so the sergeant first class, the most senior NCO in the platoon, was away at what's called Master Gunner School. Master Gunner School is where really good NCO gets sent to learn everything about how that gun system works. They're the ones that come back to the unit and are kind of like the subject matter expert in the unit for gunnery and how that weapon system works. And it's a very involved and very difficult course. So he was gone. His name was Sergeant First Class Richard Yankee, which is an amazing name. And Sergeant Yankee was gone. And so I came to my unit without a platoon sergeant because he was away at school. And my platoon told me that they all told me, watch out, because he's deaf in his left ear. So I was like, okay. And they told me he was a really mean and scary guy for like weeks. And then Sergeant Yankee finally comes back, and he's from Massachusetts, and he has kind of like a thick Boston accent. And I was talking to him, and finally he's like, why are you yelling at me, sir? Because he wasn't deaf in his left ear. But they told me that, and I had believed them. So I was kind of like yelling. It wasn't, he was a really amazing NCO in that he said, this is your platoon, asterisk, when you're in the field. But he had just a really good ability to pull me aside when I needed to be pulled aside, but nobody else knew about it, and help me to sort of to learn. And he was a really gruff guy, and he liked to give me a lot of shit. But once he realized I was cool with that, we had a really, really, really good relationship, which is much different than my second platoon, where my platoon sergeant was weak, and it was a much different environment. I told him, eventually, because I think that the best way to take over leadership of any organization is to not do a whole lot when you first get there. You want to kind of see how things are going and kind of observe. I mean, you're still in charge from day one, and if something goes wrong, it's still your responsibility. But I tend to think it's a mistake to sort of run in and say, okay, I'm here now, and here's 10 new policies that I want to enact, et cetera, rather than just sort of seeing how things work. And if things are working and there's no compelling reason to change them, then you don't need to change them, particularly when you're the new guy who doesn't really know how things are supposed to work in the first place.
Well, how did you, so I'm making some assumptions here that part of this role where you're in a small metal box of people where you doing something stupid could hurt them or kill them at some point. Presumably there was an element of them having this notional sense of, do we trust this guy? Is he going to kill us, or is he going to look after us? If that's true, how did you build your credibility with them? How did you get them to the point where they're like, yeah, I mean, he's an officer, whatever, but he's our officer, as it were.
He's all right for an officer. I mean, I think one of the things, and again, I'm in some ways speculating because I never was in an infantry platoon, or another kind of military unit or another military branch. But there's nowhere to hide in a tank. You can't hide from your crew, not just your mistakes in the tank itself, but they're all listening to the radio too. So if the commander chews you out on the radio, unlike an infantry platoon where it's just you and the radio guy that are listening to the radio, everybody hears you. They all hear that you screwed this thing up. So I think it's really important that you come to terms with that early, and you just be authentic, because you can't fake some sort of professional distance in a way from these guys. Obviously you always have the professional distance that you're an officer, but you're in this group, you're in this very confined space, very intimate environment with these people, and they're going to see you screw up when you screw up. They're going to see you do great things when you do great things. And you just have to, I think, be very open and honest about it. And particularly when I first got to the tank, one of the benefits of being the platoon leader is usually they give you the best gunner in the platoon, because really that gunner is in many ways functioning as the tank commander, because you're often at orders or you're doing something else, and he's often the one, or now he or she is the one that is really doing the day-to-day stuff. And also when you're in combat is such a good gunner that it doesn't require a lot of sort of supervision. But I ask a lot of questions. I was like, how do you do this? How do you do that? How does this thing work? How do I change track? Let me get down, let me put my coveralls on and get down the motor pool with you and do these things. Which, and again, it's not that I was the greatest leader in the world. I think this should be obvious, but number one, it shows your crew that, hey, you're part of the team. You're not better than they are. You're not too good to get down and turn wrenches and wash the tank off. Like I always, at the wash rack on the way, when you come in from the field, you go to these massive, like bird baths, they call them, which are these massive concrete sort of pools that you drive the tank in, and then you have like fire hoses, and it takes a good half a day to clean all the mud off these things. And a bad officer would sort of jump off the tank, and there were some that did this, and go back to the headquarters and do stuff, paperwork or whatever. I think the most basic good officer stays there and cleans the vehicle with everybody else, because otherwise, as we talked about earlier, your crew is down a person. Everybody else has 4 people doing it, and if you just take off and leave, they only have 3, and their tank has to be just as clean as anybody else's. So I always thought that it was really important to know the job of everybody else, not so I could correct them, but so I would know what they should be doing. But also, if we're out in the middle of nowhere and something goes wrong, I need to know how to fix it, like anybody else does. So, and I think that builds a lot of team building or cohesion within that group, where they see you all the time, and they're always watching you. And so you have to just be yourself, and hopefully yourself is a good, inspiring person, because if you're not, they're going to see it. And they're going to see if you fall apart on the radio, or you fall apart because you're stressed, because you get lost or whatever, they're going to see you, because they're literally like right there with nothing else to do but sort of look at you.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Please join us again for next week's episode, when we'll continue the conversation with Waitman Beorn on small team leadership. You've been listening to Battling with Business. Thanks for listening. Cheerio.